now that we started recording and I see we're almost 30, shall we get started? Kiki, do you want to go first or? Yeah. I think you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me here to be with you all. This is such a fascinating topic for me, and I'm really happy to always talk about it in leftist spaces. It's, you know, the question of grassroots religious practices, because it's something that so many leftist spaces, like when we hear religion, we don't want anything to do with that, or spirituality, like we think that it's like backward hocus pocus kind of stuff. And in this question, though, about how can we share the world together? How can we create a world where many worlds fit? This is a huge question of what does that mean? What do we mean by worlds? We have a planet Earth, but is that the same thing as our conceptions of worlds? And so I work a lot with this idea in political theory and philosophy, and trying to figure out what we mean by that and how we can share the world while still respecting difference. And I have found that theologians are the ones that are doing the work that I find the most interesting, talking about these questions, because those are questions about basically how we understand how we live in the universe, on the planet. Like, what are our beliefs? What are our values? What are our ethics? And I feel like a lot of those questions don't get discussed enough on the left. Instead, we have like these concepts like, oh, well, I'm anti-capitalist. And then we don't really talk about like, so what does capitalism mean? And like in terms of belief system and how we live with each other and how we can share that world. So very briefly, I'm just going to spend less than 10 minutes just summarizing this, the reading I was assigned to read and to present. And it is John Womack's chapter, Exodus in Chiapas, the Celtal Catechism of Liberation, Ocosingo, 1972, which is in this bigger compilation called Rebellion in Chiapas, an historical reader. And I was very happy to be introduced to this piece because it's actually a translation of the conversations that were going on in Chiapas before the Zapatista movement came, and their questions about liberation theology. And I've had this question for quite some time, trying to figure out how can we talk about liberation theology and how it has informed the political proposal of the Zapatistas, even if it's not talked about in theological ways. And so just very briefly, before beginning, I want to recognize that we have very, very good reasons for not wanting to talk about religion when we talk about struggle, especially in the Americas, because Catholicism was forcefully, violently imposed on us, especially the countries colonized, or the areas colonized by the Iberian Peninsula. And so for sure, just recognizing, that the Columbus voyage actually was very much this apocalyptic Catholic idea that the world is coming to an end, and those Catholic monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, were tasked by the Pope to kind of be these saviors to help everybody see the light and convert to Christianity. And in that same year, 1492, before October 12, something happened earlier that's actually part of the story of the creation of the modern world. And that is the fall of Granada, which on January 2nd, 1492, which was the last stronghold of Muslim rule through the Moors in the Iberian Peninsula. And I was actually just in Granada this past summer and just studying that a bit more, and learned that Columbus was actually there awaiting the fall of Granada. And after Granada fell, he was given permission to sail west. And the reason why he wanted to sail west ultimately was because he believed that now that the Catholic world had overtaken and beat the Muslims, now we got to take Jerusalem. And so he wanted to go west instead of east, because obviously there's Ottoman Empire stronghold in the east. And Carol Delaney has actually written about this in a whole entire book about the Jerusalem project of Columbus. And the important thing about that, I think, to recognize is that the project was to impose one world on everybody. So while under the Ottoman Empire and under Moorish rule, if you were Christian, you could continue being Christian. If you were Jewish, you could continue being Jewish. But when the Catholic monarchs took over the Iberian Peninsula, they forced everybody to be Catholic. And there was no other way that you could be different. And so this then came over to us. The burning of the Moors books happened before the burning of the Maya books. A lot of the torture methods from the Inquisition to confirm that people weren't lying about having converted to Catholicism were torture methods that were used here. So a lot of the death and destruction that we witnessed was already taking place internally within Europe as Europe was creating itself as modern Europe, 1492 forward. So the readings, I think, understanding that history, then the readings and the history of liberation theology, which grew from the Americas, in particular Latin America, with a very liberatory anti-capitalist lens, the quote unquote preferential option for the poor, was this idea from priests that had been radicalized, working in community, in indigenous communities, and learning to listen. And instead of trying to impose the word of God on them, they decided that they were going to look for the word of God that was already existing in their everyday practices. And if we think about that, and if we know about how like the Zapatista movement today functions, it is precisely about the exercise of power that already exists as potentials within the community, rather than imposing power from above on down, like so many traditional leftist movements have done, Soviet Union emblematic of that. So there was a lot of these parallels in the readings. It was so exciting to see this was a translation of the conversations that the catechists had with indigenous peoples. And again, this was before the first movement folks from the EZLN came. Very famously, the first EZLN members were Marxist-Leninists. We're going to impose the way of revolution on the communities, but then found out that the communities were already organized and had these really radical ways of being and seeing. And so it ended up really transforming the original EZLN into something that is really different for me, very exciting for many people, very exciting because it talks so much about dignity, and we see these in the readings. There are prayers there that talk about, please help us form a community where we can realize how valuable we are, which is very different from the traditional Catholicism that was telling us all that we were nothing and that we needed to stop being Indian and we needed to become modern, become someone else. And so what's so beautiful about this text is that we see here the philosophy, the spirituality, the ideology, whatever it is that we want to call it, the belief system, the things that move and that motivate. And it is completely laden in struggle. It says God wants us to struggle for our freedom. Everything is about the community rather than the individual. And so in these questions, in these themes, I think that we can find a really rich way to have conversations with each other about our world, our other geographies, and how it is that if we can talk at this level of the way we understand, live, and feel the universe, the cosmos, I think maybe we can have more richer conversations and understandings with each other about what it would mean to create a world where many worlds fit. What are those ideas that we have about difference in particular? Because so much of the modern world is so obsessed with sameness, of everybody becoming the same, of the world being just one, and the negation and the extinction, extermination of other possibilities. I'll leave it at that. I think that may have been 10 minutes.
Thank you. That was inspiring. And when you were talking, I was already noticing some of the themes, similar themes that come out from like the two different topics of this week's reading group. And one main theme I noticed was this sort of precisely like you said, going beyond this black and white perception of religion in leftist spheres. There was the same perception regarding like Islamic tradition in the Kurdish movement in its earlier stages, with Marxist-Leninists coming and, you know, having a specific perspective and approach towards spirituality and religion. But that clashing first, I guess, with people's, like with the masses way of relating to their religion, but also clashing with the hegemonic project that the Turkish state and the occupying states in Kurdistan have been implementing regarding religion and religious affairs and how to regulate it, and the sort of counter hegemonic practices that try to reclaim back some of those spaces that have been lost to sort of state central authority on religious affairs. In the chapter that you had a chance to look at, that was from my master's thesis, that I am a little ashamed now, you know, going back and reading the writing could have been better. I tried to sort of argue and analyze precisely this point and the different ways in which like religion has been, or religious spaces, religious conversations have been recuperated bit by bit by the Kurdish movement in the past 2-3 decades. The chapter you read is from my master's thesis, where I did fieldwork both in Bakur, northern Kurdistan, and in Istanbul. And after, it was happening in the backdrop of, while I was doing the research for the first time in history, the Kurdish movement had entered negotiations with the Turkish state for a, you know, peaceful solution to the issue. And the previous 2-3 decades had been, you know, marred with violence, war, and conflict. And during that time, religion and Islam had been a hot battleground between the state and the movement. The state, much like how Pakistan was legitimizing its occupation of Bangladesh right after the independence in mid-20th century, Turkish state had developed all these mechanisms of control over religion, even though after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, there was supposed to be some sort of secular Turkish republic that was being constructed. That has been a mirage, and religion, like the state had set up Directorate of Religious Affairs, which has more funding than like a third of the ministries combined, and funding imams. Religion has been like state hegemony and control over religious affairs had increased throughout the 20th century. And the Turkish state used the sort of like the skeptical view of PKK cadres coming from that Marxist-Leninist leftist ideology and perspective. The state effectively used this as a propaganda to delegitimize the people's struggle and movement for autonomy and, you know, self-administration, using the Marxist roots and tendencies within the Kurdish movement as you see, like they're just a bunch of red atheists, and they don't reflect Kurdish society and Kurdish values, etc. And the Kurdish movement experienced this transformation of prefiguration, I would argue, beginning in the 1990s. And from a more vanguard party, it began to increase its base in the 90s and transform into a movement of people's liberation with, a complex web of grassroots networks. And, in my dissertation and like in my thesis then and in my dissertation now, I argue that women's autonomous organizing was a main engine for change inside the Kurdish movement. But in the chapter that you read in my master's thesis, I tried to trace this transformation, this prefigurative transformation in which the PKK became more like grassroots and not top down. Yeah, in that chapter you read, I tried to trace this through sort of grassroots democratic religious practices and events such as civilian Friday prayers and the increasing use of religious themes and motifs inside the movement. So yeah, that's the brief intro that I got before going on to a more detailed discussion with everyone.
By the way, I'm so sorry. I should have given some brief introductions for you too. Would you like to introduce yourself, or I can read what I found for you on the internet? What's your preference?
Sure, I'm a PhD student in the sociology department here in Binghamton University, upstate New York. I'm a participant and scholar of social movements, particularly the Kurdish movement. And I did like I said, my MA thesis on PKK's prefigurative transformation and relation to like Muslim Kurds and policies and transformation regarding the issue of religion and the emergence of concepts such as democratic Islam, Medina Convention, and yeah, and currently I'm working on my PhD dissertation on women's autonomous economic organizing and prefigurative transformation in Russia.
Yeah, my name is Linda Kikivish, and thanks, Anya, for throwing in the chat my little about, because everyone wants to know what the last name is. I'm a popular educator and political theorist working out of my hometown, Oxnard, California, which is a little bit north of Los Angeles. And my training is as a geographer, as a political geographer. I have this fascination with borders and the modern state system. Because I'm so critical of it, just from coming from a community of undocumented migrants. The US-Mexico border was always a discussion at the dinner table. Who got deported, who just crossed, all of that. So I did university studies in geography to just study borders, and that took me to Palestine. I studied for my PhD dissertation. I created a genealogy of the maps of Palestine, Israel, the modern maps of Palestine, Israel, because I used to think that they were like old, like biblical 2,000, 5,000-year-old maps, but they're actually very new. And I thought that that was really important for us as folks accompanying the Palestine struggle because we always start with maps and then we don't really question where the maps came from and what political assumptions we might be carrying with them if we start there. So it was really just a way for me to try to see if we could have other questions about Palestine by kind of disturbing the map as like this neutral thing. And I also accompany the Zapatista struggle. I'm a student of theirs, went to their alumnus of their little school, and I do a lot of work in the US trying to amplify the struggle of the Zapatistas and the CNI in Mexico over into the Anglophone world. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Should we just go around, see how people felt when they read the readings? Maybe start with some reflections.
Okay, I'll start. I'm Dana, and my pronouns are either she or they. I spent an evening with Marianne Tenuto, who's one of the main US liaisons with the Zapatistas. And she's just a wonderful person. She's everything you could hope for in any kind of progressive organizer. And I've supported the Zapatista movement for quite a few years. And when I heard about Rojava, I said, let's import what they're doing. So I very much support their work. And I've been with the movement, with the left, for 57 years. And we're going to do it. If we don't suffocate ourselves to death first, we're going to make it. We can do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana.
I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on any of the readings, if you did them, or maybe like a little, maybe, what do you think, Emily, like maybe like a line or a phrase that kind of caught your eye or your attention?
Or raised eyebrows. Hi, Dave.
Can you hear?
Yes, I believe we can.
Okay. I did take a few notes of things I thought were quite remarkable. In the section reading on Exodus in Chiapas, these are slight paraphrases that I did. No one has a right to crush another person, nor to crush oneself. I thought that led well into a sense of community that then could be applied in so many cases. For example, when they said, whoever stays quiet steals strength from the community. Some don't speak and some speak too much. And yeah, those three taken together, I thought were interesting guides, and we could have used them in Occupy Wall Street.
May I? You made me, those sections are some that I outlined too, and I wonder if maybe unless someone would like to respond. Or maybe just to give an example, maybe if I may, just an example of how, like, of what that made me think of, to maybe model or to. No one has the right to crush another person or to crush oneself. This made me think of the Zapatistas and of Frantz Fanon, who some of us may have heard of. It makes me think of the Zapatistas in that they talk a lot about the above and the below. And so they don't really talk specifically about labels, like, are they anarchists, are they Marxists, are they this, are they that? They talk about structural position. We are the below and to the left. So the left is the way forward that they see. But in understanding, like in the sixth declaration of the Lacandon Jungle and since especially, they talk a lot about structural position. And even before, like there's a really famous communique by Marcos early on where people were trying to make fun of him and talk shit, saying Marcos is gay. And instead of him saying, I'm not gay, he came out with a community and says, yeah, Marcos is gay. Marcos is gay in San Francisco. Marcos is Jewish under Nazi Germany. And Marcos is Palestinian in Israel, which is, you know, when you think about that, wow, like, so he's affirming Jewish struggle when Jews are below, but not affirming Jewish struggle when Jews are above, instead the below. So it's very much structural position. So the political theory very much is about trying to undo this above and below structure of the modern world, that in trying to survive and trying to live, the options that we're given is to crush others by going up, by going above. Because when we go above, we assume that it implies that there continues to be a below. And this happens not just in the United States, for example, like with white and Black people, also like the good Black person trying to go above has to differentiate themselves as against the quote unquote bad Black person, or the good immigrant versus the bad immigrant. So we keep recreating these differences that are so unequal by crushing others in order to go above. So no one has the right to crush another person or to crush oneself. And this is where I started to think about Fanon, Frantz Fanon, the revolutionary theoretician and psychiatrist, revolutionary thinker for so many of the Black struggles all over the world in the 1960s especially. And what in his first book, Black Skin, White Masks, and then forward, he talks about the psychology of colonialism and what it does to us when we start to believe, those of us below, that we're nothing, when we're crushing ourselves. So I love so much that phrase, no one has the right to crush another person or to crush oneself, because we don't really think too much about the love, the self-love that we need to have, that we matter. You know, this question of dignity, I think, which is so strong in the indigenous communities in the Maya world, and I mean, something that I learned in Palestine a lot, and it's present all over in struggle.
How long is this on? Because I'm traveling and I don't want to get into, you know, I don't want to miss too much. So I would just put down my video.
Ya terminó.
Pardon? No. I
Were
mean, I
you
can
asked?
travel and turn my camera off and listen, but how long will you be, how long is this Zoom day? Oh,
How long?
So are you driving?
yeah,
That's still
yeah, I'm driving.
for 1.5 more hours more.
Oh, okay. I'm just gonna turn off my, I'm gonna turn off my video. I'm actually going to a Messianic service.
Okay, sure. Everyone's
Okay.
welcome to participate in any way you can. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
The point about, you know, when you were talking about Marcos's response, I remember that video with the Manu Chao songs, and when he says, yes, I'm a gay from San Francisco, Jew from mid-20th century Germany, and Palestinian from Israel. It made, like, and this point about above and below, I think it speaks to the Kurdish experience as well, in the sense that this acknowledgement about power relations and structures is the sort of main determinant in the movement shaping like an approach, a perspective towards any specific issue. And this this principle, this distinguish, like differentiation between the hegemonic and grassroots sort of religious or like mobilization and organizing, like comes out when when Kurdish movement figures talk about the Medina Convention in reference to like a deal that Muhammad did in the emergence of religion with non-Muslim communities, sort of a version of Islam that is more democratic and plural than the Caliphate period Islamic societies had. So it's a similar awareness where there's not just a pragmatic calculation of, oh, how can we gain religious masses and mobilize them in the movement without like a principled differentiation like this would have been disastrous, whereas this complex awareness of the above and below and how that plays into like the sphere of religion in people's lives, I think is a promising venue. Oh, great, we have people on the stack. I think Sergio first and then Konçur, if I am pronouncing it right, Konçur.
Okay, so hi everyone. Yeah, so the first thing that I would like to say is that I really enjoy the both readings. I consider that they express how religion is not a static situation, but it's part of human feelings. It's part of human way of understanding the world. And in that sense, Emre, congratulations. This is a really interesting chapter that you share with us. So I'm very thankful for this chapter. It creates a more complex perspective on what is the movement that is happening in southern Turkey and Rojava, in the sense that how do we think popular movements and transformations from below? Also, the importance of these, how these waves are very creative. They can appropriate certain aspects of people's experiences, such as the neuros, for example, I don't know how to pronounce it, neuros, for example, but at the same time from the Muslim Kurd experience of going to, and I made my list of words here, to go to the Seyda, for example, to learn from the Seyda. And in that sense, I think it's very important to see that the parallels of both movements, in the sense that it is both a communal movement, but at the same time, it has the figure of an intellectual, a communal intellectual. So how the catechista, in the sense of Chiapas, but also of Central America, plays a very important role, like an organic intellectual would, like using those Gramscian expressions of the community. And how also in the case that you show us, Emre, the importance of the Seyda or the Imam in reinterpreting what is happening in a political context. It also caught my attention how President Erdogan, he wanted to break that solidarity. He wanted to show that a proper Muslim ceremony is not attended by women, for example. But in that sense, how it was this contradictory movement, and we cannot talk only about one movement. It is happening like even as a cultural phenomenon in that sense. So how can we rethink nowadays the importance of religion, not as like fixed institutions, but as how people deal and confront realities from their emotions, from our emotions, from our fears, from our hopes. And in that sense, also the importance of creating this dialogue. And perhaps the second reading by Womack is very important in that sense, because it gives us a perspective into how this dialogue between catechists, but also like liberation theology priests, is something that is changing both of them. It's not like these priests, they came with the idea of liberation theology in the 1950s. There was no liberation theology in that moment, but it emerged, it evolved through the same relationship that they have with people. And for example, the importance of learning people's language. I think that was a very crucial aspect of these catechists and Jesuit priests and Mary's priest, for example, in the sense of conveying the importance of learning people's way of expressing, and how at the end it had this mirroring effect of how the word of God was the word of the community as well. So I thought it was really interesting.
Concher, do you want to?
Yes, hello, it's Crocker. So it's Irish, sorry.
Sorry about that.
No, don't worry, I wouldn't expect you, small language. This topic interested me particularly, and particularly Emery, your chapter, just with the parallels, I suppose, to like I live in occupied Ireland. We're still in that sort of struggle in one form or another, and the role that religion has played here in like our ethno-religious conflict. But while there's a lull, it is not gone. I found it particularly interesting, like sort of those parallels and links, given the similarities to how, on one hand, the church and religious leaders played such an important role as like a lightning rod for communities to galvanize around and sort of move their struggle outwards, but also, and I think particularly now, how the churches have become this very much, I wouldn't even call it reactionary, but like almost like a soothing force for what is legitimate concern. So in the last couple of years, we've had so much come out about like the Catholic Church's role in Magdalene laundries, and similar to how Indigenous children in Canada have been found underneath religious institutions. We have our own version of that in Tuam, where mothers who had children outside of marriage were forced to work in laundries. So you see how the church has been like, in one sense, a lightning rod for like trying to resist British rule, and on the other hand, forcing. So I think that above and below stuff becomes particularly relevant, certainly in like a reactionary free state that still exists in the South. You know, we don't have our liberation. We have two states and both of them kind of suck. I just thought those parallels are interesting, how religion can play such an emancipatory role for those who find it, but also how it plays such a crushing role in other places. Like, I'm from a Presbyterian background, so in the first United Irishmen, we're Presbyterians, and then within about 3 decades, went from being those trying to liberate all, you know, Catholic dissenter and to being those who put the boot on the neck of the other. So like, I think that's a really interesting place to see how these rules can change very, very quickly and very fluidly. You give a little bit of power to one community, and they then take that power and run with it, and the jackboot goes from being on the neck to on the foot of that particular group. And that's something that we, I think, particularly in Ireland, are still wrestling with, is like the religious dimension. And I think increasingly, as people move away from religion as a method to understand their worldview, it's harder to put that into language, because, you know, again, I live in the North, so those in the South don't see our struggle as valuable anymore because it's your way of peace. And yet, because of the religious context to it, those in the South who move away from religion because of the disgust they feel for the Catholic Church and how it's treated women and gay people and everything in our world, means that there's no more lens to even reach out across. And I feel a bigger drift with my, you know, fellow Irishmen south of the border than I think I would have if I was born 50 years ago. So I think it's interesting, given I really found your chapter fascinating, seeing how there's a similar weaponization of religion, both in a positive sense and in a negative sense in Kurdistan. And I've talked too long, I'm sorry, but very good. I'm very interested in this, and thank you for
Not at all. Not at all. Your contribution is much appreciated, and Sergio's as well. I agree. I guess this takes us a little back to the point Kiki made about the environment we had in leftist circles and how that's shifting. I mean, both in Rojava and I'm guessing to a similar degree in Latin America, there was this skeptical and impractical approach towards religion and religious arguments and rhetoric, which I would argue, in the case of the Kurdish movement, has prevented the sort of expansion of its base and its influence, because Kurdish society has been religious like for centuries, and I think what's unique about the experiences both in Kurdistan and in Chiapas, and now I'm hearing more about the Irish cases, these movements abandoned that sort of ineffective, I would call somewhat toxic way of relating to religion, not necessarily as sort of like a tactical top-down strategy, but as a result of the sort of both the grassroots aspect of it and how religion still plays an important role in the way communities, people perceive their world and perceive material conditions and inequalities of this like worldly lives we have, as opposed to, you know, some life and justice beyond this world. So yeah, one thing that catches my eye is how this prefiguration, you know, if it was sort of like a top-down tactic, people would see through it and it would be ineffective. So this like grassroots, you know, Kurdish people pushing the movement to stop using phrases like religion is the opium of people and start using phrases like, look, Islam is not hegemonic. Islam is not necessarily based on power, state power. There are democratic, egalitarian, communitarian readings of Islam that caliphates and statehead and emperors have suppressed for centuries. And now let's try to revitalize this. So in a, I guess, similar way to the emergence of, you know, liberation theology and other similar examples from different parts of the world. Anya, do you have your, I mean, you're,
That's my hand, yes. My digital hand. Yeah, it's just fascinating to see these examples of you know, liberatory potential of religion, because I often find myself in arguments about, you know, the impossibility of you know, reforming religion, or the impossibility of, yeah, I mean, for religion to exist in a non-oppressive form. And we've included the short reading on Rojava as well as like one of the optional readings, and that I think shows you know, how they were able from the very beginning, right? So with the PKK in North Kurdistan, I see the origins, right, of this different approach to religion, right? And the PKK was forced by its support base, popular support base, but then in Rojava, it looks like from the very beginning, they already, you know, people already sort of came in with this approach, right? That, you know, we need religious coexistence, and, you know, whatever religions we have here, you know, they have to be in conversation, they have to respect each other, and sort of all this. There are different institutions that sort of facilitate dialogue, right, very intentionally, and you know, it's you know, I think it's a great proof that yes, it's possible to continue with our religious beliefs and practices in a way that does not perpetuate how religion has been used by oppressive agents. And I think another interesting question about the women, which Emre, in your chapter, which we assigned, we didn't assign these chapters only on women, but in your chapters, so you mentioned that still this civil prayers Friday prayers. They were still, you know, men only, right, without women's participation. But I do know that the Kurdish movement, because, you know, it has also this very strong gender component, you know, for liberation of women. I know that, you know, women have been able to enter these religious spaces more. And again, in that article on Rojava, I believe they, you know, they have a photo of 3 representatives of different religions in Rojava, and one of them is a Muslim Arab woman, and she also represents her community in this one of the institutions for religious interchange and dialogue. Yeah. I know. Sorry, before you say something, I know we have one participant here who is my friend, who knows a little bit more about women participating in sort of religious practices.
It's me.
Hi,
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thank you for great readings. I also read that part, Emre. One of participants' interviews claimed that there were no women during this civil disobedience Friday prayer. But I was in Istanbul during the term, but after that too. And Kurdish women, Kurdish religious women also participated all Friday praise, and also they were next to men in the streets or in the parks. But one thing that was different is related to organization of religious people or conservative people under a new institutions. DIDER, you also mentioned about that. After 2013, DIDER, this is the institution that has a close relationship with the movement. They have common meetings, and they participate all kind of struggles within the movement in northern Kurdistan. And also in the organization of the institution, women also take active role. And they were also one of the organizers of the Friday prayer in Istanbul, at least, because we all Kurdish people, almost all of them attended to Friday prayer, and some were observing, some were watching, but most of women participated in it. And not just for Friday prayer, but also religious people or religious Kurdish people have been part of the movement and took active role in all institutions of the movement in northern Kurdistan. That's why, yeah, there were many women.
Thank you. Some really good points. I want to divide my response into 2 parts, one about Rojava and one about women. I agree that the sort of multi-religious, like secular environment built in Rojava over the past decade rests heavily on the Kurdish movement's experiences on the issue in different parts of Kurdistan in the years before Rojava revolution. I mean, the developments I try to outline in the chapter, you can see how they evolved into similar, but I guess more clear, more like more organized versions in Rojava. One example is, you know, we talk about, I talk about in the chapter is how there's the, you know, Democratic Islam Congress and the assembly, a similar assembly we see in Rojava in 2014. This is from the Rojava Information Center piece we had in the recommended readings. The Religious Assembly established in 2014, and how that brings members of local Christians, Yazidis, and Muslims together serves like as a sort of more clarified extension of the assemblies we had up in the north. But unlike the north like Bakur experience, there's also the religion and beliefs office, which is more sort of institutionalized, which is more coming from the sort of party, so to speak, as opposed to grassroots. I mean, that possibility of institutionalization, of course, wasn't possible in Bakur because of lack of autonomy and the extreme levels of oppression. But I would agree with you, Anyo, when we talk about Rojava as sort of like the crystallization of the PKK project, Kurdish movement project, what the PKK hasn't been able to do in other parts of Kurdistan due to lack of autonomy. We were able to see sort of like more applications, practical applications of the ideas and strategies the movement developed as it was transforming in the 90s. The point about women, I too have been in civilian Friday prayers where there were women, but in the ones that I attended, they were not sitting next to men. They were sort of, it was a little more segregated along gender areas, especially at the time, Friday afternoon, when the prayer is called. It was usually men forming up groups and lines and praying, and women either like in a space right next to or nearby, but not like mixed, was my experience. And I shared that excerpt quote from Rushan, like the feminist activist in Ahmet, who talks about where are the women? You know, it's very male-dominated environment. I shared that quote because it's sort of like provided an alternative take, because many people that I was talking to were saying how women were actively participating in these events too. So yeah, I would say there is a little bit of tension there, perhaps. But I would also agree with you that there were other cases, and especially in, let's say, maybe not in Civil Friday prayers, but the establishment of, you know, like democratic Islamic Congress and the way how religious, like issues that are somewhat religious are determined is not like women are involved in those processes too, like especially issues that impact women's lives more directly, such as, you know, men marrying multiple women and using religion as a means to justify that, etc. I see Abdekin, you wanted to add something? I don't want to.
Oh, may intervene, Dana. She put her.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah. There's no stack on my screen. I just wanted to say something when we were talking about religion. The basic, as far as I know, the most central tenet of any widespread religion on earth is treat other people the way you would like to be treated if you were in their situation.
Absolutely, and I think this speaks to the Kurdish experience too, right? Kurds for decades occupied and ruled by these colonist powers, and how they used religion in a way to hegemonize and to manipulate religious arguments to get more obedience from Kurds, whereas in Rojava, even though majority of Kurds are Muslim, the the plurality, the multi-religious, everyone being able to set up their spaces of practice and practice freely, educate, themselves in their religions. Having all these freedoms shows Kurds, like the Kurdish movement, has that experience of the hegemonic use of religion and religious affairs, and there's a conscious refusal to do so, to reproduce that dynamic. I'll pick in Arthur, I think.
Second, you raised your hand before I did.
Okay, I'll go. I would like to share a couple of things from my life in Turkey, Germany here, both being involved with the Kurdish liberation movement and also later when I came to the United States with the Zapatistas, and also try to address Jeffrey's question regarding the inherent segregation of men and women in Islam. I think there is some inherent segregation of men and women in all Abrahamic religions, strictly seen, right? You will see this in Orthodox Judaism, you will see this in certain Christian denominations, and you will see it in Islam, definitely it exists. But when I was in my teenager years, I thought all Kurdish people are Alevites. Alevites are Shiite, how should I call them, denomination. And they are represented in Turkey, but also in other countries in West Asia and in the Balkans. Actually, my ancestry goes to the Balkans. And I learned later in life that we were Bektashi, we were also another Shiite denomination related to the Alevites. And even when I came to Germany, most of the Kurdish people around me were all Alevites. Why am I talking so much about Alevites? How Alevites worship is actually not the 5 times prayers separately, women and men separately in the mosque. They worship together, side by side. Actually, it's a dance. It's called semah. And it's a round dance. Men and women do it together, side by side. And women usually don't cover. Alawite women don't cover themselves like most of the Sunni denominations do. So there are differences there, and when we use the word inherent, I think we should be careful with that, because the practice of certain denominations might be completely different. And I believe that different spirituality, I'm going to use the word spirituality also, versus organized religion from the top, spirituality from the bottom can be completely different than what and I'm going to call Abrahamic patriarchal structures from the top dictate us. So also one other thing from the Mexican side of things, when I was there, 2006, 2007, maybe somewhere around that time, I wasn't very familiar with Mexico at that time. These were my first trips, and I didn't even get involved with Zapatistas. This was a business trip. So, and I'm going through these churches and looking at pictures. I discovered this Virgin Mary, a dark Virgin Mary, the Lady of the Guadalupe, everywhere. And later I learned also, this is also identified as Tonantzin, which is a Nahua goddess, really. Our sacred mother is how it translates. It's one and the same. So we see this in Islam, in the Sufi Alevite traditions of our own. And we see this also in South America. These indigenous traditions, sometimes even promoted by the Catholic Church, because they see they can gain people more easily if they give them what they already had. And the same things happened in Anatolia, in West Asia, with Islam. Many of those old indigenous traditions from that region were integrated into Islam, were modified sometimes. So yes, there is the inherent patriarchy of Abrahamic religions, fully agree with that, but there is a lot more diversity also living today in our traditions, in our religions. That was it, thank you.
Thank you. Arthur, did you have something to add?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and first, like this is such a wonderful session. I really appreciate y'all, Kiki and Emre, for what you're bringing to this, and the readings were phenomenal. I think to me, I'm always kind of trying to think about how these lessons, what these lessons can teach us, what these historical kind of circumstances can teach us more universally about revolutionary strategy and like the meaning of liberation itself more broadly. And I think, like, as somebody who got politicized in this Western leftist tradition, and certainly like earlier on in my politicization had this like certainly had this kind of dogmatic, Emre, I think you called it toxic, rightly so, approach to religion itself. I'm not personally a religious person, but I know, for example, like to share a personal anecdote, I spent a little bit of time in Chiapas a few times doing solidarity work with the Zapatista movement, and especially in my like first visit, I was very confused originally when I realized that like many or most of the compas down there were like deeply religious people. One of the earliest things I did there was like help the compañeros like build a church. And initially my reaction, which really was coming from my own ignorance, was like, this seems totally backwards. This is the religion of the oppressor and the colonizer. So this must, you know, this particular community hasn't been fully radicalized or politicized, right? And that's of course coming just from like deep arrogance and ignorance. And eventually through my experience like in the community realized my own ignorance that I was bringing to this, that no, there was no actual contradiction there, that sure, you know, some of the kind of official symbolism had its origins in the colonial society, but this was a living, breathing culture. This was a community practicing its own sense of self and way of being and understanding the world. And it was one and the same with their practice of self-determining in a political sense and struggling. And I feel like that was a really important lesson to learn as a leftist. I think as like so-called revolutionaries, it's so crucial to understand like the power and importance that culture and religion play, not just in a sort of like tactical sense, but that in its essence, it's the real meaning behind self-determination is whatever the community is and identifies itself as, that is the sort of meat on the bones of that struggle, right? That is the thing that is defending itself. And I feel like in both of these cases, both in Chiapas and in Kurdistan, like these revolutionary movements, their sort of social base, if you will, the communities that provide that base, both had this strong sense of spiritual practice and identity, and that lended itself in important ways to like the very power of the movements that grew out of them. But I also think there's a really crucial lesson here where in both of these cases, the revolutionary organizations, the revolutionary leadership, if you will, that originally in both cases came from a more secular Marxist-Leninist background, they both, maybe through their humility, their political savvy, some of it being just circumstantial and like strategic necessity, came around to embracing and integrating those identities and practices into the political movement itself. And like part of that, I think, is understanding the political strength that's bound up in that. And part of it is just understanding that if that's not a part of this struggle, then it's not meaningfully a struggle of self-determination for communities. And I'm so sorry, the last thing I wanted to say is that like, at the same time, it's a dynamic relationship. I know like in Chiapas, I had more firsthand experience in understanding this dynamic where the traditions, some of them religious traditions, were also influenced by the revolutionary politics that the political organization brought. And I saw that manifest most strongly in gender dynamics, where the more traditional patriarchal kind of structures were being challenged And that was a direct influence by kind of leftist ideology, but it wasn't a contradiction to the religion. It was just kind of the truth of this living, breathing culture and this dynamic relationship between politics and culture. So I'm going to shut myself up. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. I think we have Dave and Hassan instead.
Did you say Dana? Yeah.
I said Dave, but sure,
Oh, Dave.
I'm really bad at moderating, sorry.
Yes, I can really relate to what Arthur's talking about. A lot of us solidarity workers from the previous generations encountered this in the civil rights movement, where the church was so central to the movement, and also something I was involved in even a little earlier, which was the farm workers unionizing struggles, where again religion was a central thing. And yet within those movements, there were people who were not solidarity workers, who were part of those communities, who also had different views, especially about Christianity as a religion that had enslaved their people, and they sort of hadn't gotten over that and didn't care to. I wanted to ask something, maybe it's a little off topic. I've been reading elsewhere that we all have multiple identities, and that we're not always quite aware of that, but that we can use them to bridge to other communities and find what we have in common, and not just how we're different. And so I wondered whether Kurds, as a suppressed minority in several countries, whether that helped them in their progress towards a feminist movement, or whether that's not all coming from Bookchin. The women were organizing from I don't know what year for their own empowerment, and pushed that until it became more accepted in that movement. But I wonder if this plays a role.
Just to clarify, if this sort of breaking the state's hegemony over religious affairs and including more grassroots democratic readings of religion, you're asking whether that has helped women make strides in the movement as well?
I'm asking whether the consciousness, the awareness of Kurds as a suppressed minority group helped them to look at themselves in their gender relations. As at one time in this country, there was, for example, a very important Black-Jewish alliance that was based on the different sorts of discrimination in different countries against those two groups. And that was very conscious, right? So I'm just wondering whether it's that, or whether it's more something else that causes the sections of the Kurdish movement to be among the most advanced in terms of women's empowerment.
I think it's a two-part dynamic. In the one hand, the Kurdish movement consciousness as a movement of oppressed people, of course, illuminates the sort of alternative project that Kurdish movement proposes. It informs it deeply. It is the reason why democratic confederalism is very much decentralized and multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and I guess this trend is strongest in the case of women's liberation and women's mobilization. I don't know if this really speaks to your question, but I think the two topics are also quite closely connected. The women's autonomous organizing in the Kurdish movement, and the strides women have been making, and the increasing participation of religious people in the movement, and the different ways in which Kurdish movement related to debates over religion, let's say over the past 2 decades, as opposed to before the transformation in the 90s. I think they are all in they are closely interconnected too, because much of the gender dynamics and inequalities that have operated in the geography in Kurdistan were partially fed by those like Islamic, Islamic view on gender relations. I mean, the oppressive readings and applications of Islam that further solidified gender and deepened gender inequality. So I think it couldn't have happened in an alternative way where, women increasing their agency in society while like the hegemonic place of Islam remains uncontested. I don't know if that could have happened. I don't know if that speaks to your question fully. I hope it does, Dave. And I think we have Hassan and Mustak.
Hello, comrades. My name is Hassan. I'm from Iranian Kurdistan, and I am living now in Germany. I am in critical solidarity with Rojava and Zapatista as a Marxist with dialectical perspective and emancipatory view. I can't support 100% Rojava, and I can't support 100% Zapatista too. They are the both of them are left nationalist movement in the time of neoliberalism and capitalism, and we see clear in the both of this society, the working class, the middle class, and the bourgeoisie. We have a class struggle in Rojava and in Chiapas too. And I think that the left anarchist people in Western society, they bring a radical romanticization of this movement. We have in Kurdistan different movements. In Iranian Kurdistan, we have communist movement, we have nationalist movement, left nationalist movement, we have Islamic Salafist movement, we have social democratic movement and other movement. And I think in Rojava is the worst. It is the same. Maybe the Iranian Kurdistan 40 years ago in Iranian Kurdistan we had radical revolution, and we had one for short time. We had one government, self-organized government in some cities, and then we can compare with Paris, Commune of Paris, and the people organized the society, and the left people and communist movement, they were the representative of the society in Kurdistan. But in Rojava, we have actually PKK as only the strong party with really view between revolution and counter-revolution. The PKK is not a revolutionary party. The PKK is the party of realpolitik, and the realpolitik is not revolutionary politik. When we need a revolutionary politik, and the revolutionary politik is not secularism, it's not the social contract that we have in Rojava. It is more, and the socialist movement in our society, they have to support left nationalism when we don't have radical communist movement in society. We have to do because of right wings in our society, because of fascist Islamist movement, because of isolation of Kurdish and other minority in our society. But the Kurdish movement, it is not the same. And the Kurdish movement is, you can see the reactionary actually perspective in the books of Öcalan and other Kurdish authors, for example, but the left people in Germany or in other countries, they think Öcalan is emancipatory. When I think he's not, because he want to compromise with Islamic group, with clans, with tribes, with other organizations that they are not revolutionary. They are against revolution. The religions, for example, we have so many religious organizations. They have power in the society. We have so many tribes in Arabic region and Kurdish region of Rojava. They are really strong. They have the army. They have everything. They have money. They have power. And the YPG and YPG, they can't stop them. They don't like to take a power and take a hegemony from this organization and tribes and clans. And we can, and on the other hand, we have an army of Assad in Qamishli. For example, the airport of Qamishli, the army from Assad control the airport from Qamishli. And the teachers, the bureaucrats, people in Rojava, the government in Syria, they pay for teachers and other. We have one state in other state. And when we have two states in one state together, we don't have revolution. So many people, they speak every time about revolution in Russia, but it is not revolution. That revolution destroyed the national state. That revolution is a radical, with radical
Hassan,
perspective of emancipation. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. So we have some people that also want to talk. So thank you for sharing. We can continue with this conversation, but we do have other people. Thank you for your understanding.
I want to respond to Hassan later, but I think we have Dana and Ilhan up on stage. Then I want to go.
Me? Did you say Dana? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. As to what is inherent in any religious practice, I'm strictly atheist, but I don't bug people about their religion. I'll be glad to explain at the drop of a hat why I'm atheist, but what's inherent is not always what's the common practice. I guarantee you there is nothing in the Quran that prescribes clitoridectomy. Anywhere, there's nothing that could even be understood that way. The women's room, I've read that passage that people use to set up a women's room. It's addressed entirely to the woman's husband, not to the whole community. Muhammad was a good-hearted person. He would never have prescribed brutal mistreatment of children or torturing someone to insanity by solitary confinement. There are a lot of things that are, and the separation of genders for worship, is that anywhere in the Quran? There are just a lot of things that are much more flexible than we're usually given to understand. And anything that's toxic to the overall practice needs to be examined closely for, is it in fact prescribed by some ultimate being, and is it useful, is it supportive to the community? In San Francisco in the 70s, there was a big conflict in the intermission between lesbians and Latinos. There was a lesbian restaurant and a lesbian bar within a couple of blocks each other, right in the center of the intermission. And women coming out of them would go around the corner and be attacked by Latinos lurking in ambush, and they'd be raped and or get the hell beaten out of them. And the guys would say, we're doing this because you're lousing up our neighborhood, get out. And it finally got so bad that a huge community meeting was called. And the basic principle that was expressed was that time-honored Mideastern adage, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And things calmed down after that community meeting. Okay, the other is tangential. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think we have Ilhan and Krekar Mustafa next.
Thank you. I wanted to circle back kind of to touch on what Dave was asking around how whether Kurdish oppression helps kind of determine feminism within the Kurdish revolutionary movement. And I also wanted to touch on what Mr. Altekin was saying, because I believe that there's a connection again with Alevism and the Alevi people in influencing the gender roles within Kurdish culture and within rural Anatolian communities as a whole. My family is of Arab background, but we're also Alevi, Arab Alevi. And I just don't think that that can be underestimated in how progressive the mindset of that spiritual tradition actually is and how influential it is. And then another thing I want to say is there's a huge rural-urban divide in Turkish culture, and I believe that Kurdish people are extremely impacted by this, and this also affects how they present themselves in Islam, because I believe rural village life does not fit these tidy roles that are seen in urban environments around religion, around religious spaces, around gender roles. For example, and from what I understand, many Kurds, when they move to urban areas, because there's not a lot of opportunity in the rural areas, they have to kind of take on more of an Islamic identity. They already have the strike against them of Kurdishness. They have to kind of attach and show that they're good, pious Muslims and perform Islam, I believe, in a different manner than they would in a village environment. And that includes like wearing full coverage for women and participating in more religious practices in different manners than they might in a village environment where they're at home, where they're with their own people. And I think that also can't be underestimated. And then just like speaking on the appearance of somebody and how they present in a society versus what they're actually believing and thinking, I mean, that's a huge, that we can't make assumptions around this. For example, I was privileged with being able to stay with a Kurdish family in Istanbul over a decade ago. And on the outside, they looked very religiously conservative. The women would wear full black outside. Inside, when we were all together, like watching television, they made some of the most progressive comments around gender, around accepting transgender people, around all these things that I was shocked by, honestly. And I think most of the Western world would have been shocked by the sentiment that these people would have just based on their appearance and what we would see on the outside of the performance of their religious presentation. So that was just what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Krekar and Alex.
I think Alex was first.
Oh, sure. Sorry. Alex and Krekar.
Monitoring.
Sure. Thank you, guys. So I'm going to try to keep this quick just because I'm very interested in like where this conversation is going and everything. There were some things about it that sort of, I'm like eternally fascinated by how quickly this comes home for me, personally, just because like, here in the US, we have sort of a disconnection, I think, from global geopolitics. It's just a part of like the, the privilege, I guess. But so like here in the US, we also have like a massive problem of like division between urban and rural centers. And like, for as hegemonic as the state is, I think that there are pieces of rural America where the state has just forgotten about it. Places like my hometown. My hometown is like a city, it's like the largest county by land area in Northeast Ohio, but it's one of the smallest by population density. And so like there's no, drivers of culture in the area, and like, sort of neoliberal capitalism is just like leaving it behind. And so what is coming in its wake is sort of like this tension between what many people would consider, far right politics and far left politics. But it doesn't feel revolutionary if you're just living in the town. It's just a thing that's always been happening because the rest of the world has forgotten about it. And so like a lot of those conversations happen in churches. There's like the Church of the Nazarene, which is like a church that I, went to a lot when I was growing up, not because I was like a believer in that denomination, but because my grandparents were. I always hated going to church. It was a thing that I've like really resented and never, ever looked forward to. And it drove a lot of my personal convictions about like, needing to leave this town and just escape it and just like, live elsewhere. A lot of my, a lot of my life decisions were sort of driven by that exact, thing. I need to get away from this because I don't feel safe here. And like, there are elements in that town that are Christo-fascist. It's like Christian dominionism. I think that like it's just straight up Christian dominionism. It's like not even trying to hide. There's lots of cultural attitudes that prevail about how gay people are an abomination and like trans people are an abomination and all kinds of stuff like that. And then at the same time, my grandmother's, her generation, they would do things that we would consider mutual aid, but it was not like a labeled thing. It was just a thing that people were doing. My grandmother made everybody's clothes when I was growing up. And like, even more so when she was raising her children. When she was a girl, she was like, there would be like quilting clubs where people would just sort of like come together and take care of each other. And it was a thing where it didn't, there was like no exchange of money for these quilts. It was just like a thing of, it was a cultural thing. In Milwaukee, where I live now, it's like, we just did like some prison abolition, like a big event. And a lot of our supplies came from a church. Like we had a member who just, would go to church regularly on Sundays, and they no questions asked, just supplied us with a bunch of stuff. And it was like not something they expected us to replenish. It was just, here's some things. Yeah, and so I'm trying to, I don't really have a point. I'm just trying to like be part of this conversation and be present for it by just kind of examining the ways that it touches, I guess, my life. Yeah, so that's all I had to say.
Thank you, Alex. I think it was Krekar next.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Krekar Mustafa. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Hamburg in Germany. I write my thesis on the Kurdish response to nation-state building in Syria and Iraq. And so I mainly deal with Rojava, actually, as my main thesis question. But I actually wanted to ask a question. My question goes to Ambry. I more or less deal with the economy and politics of Rojava, but religion is not one of the things I work on. But my question was, how do you look at the religious minorities? I mean, the Assyrians, the Christians, the Yazidis. How do you look at it in reality in Rojava? What is their place in the society generally? How accepting the society generally is towards especially the Yazidi minority community there? I know in terms of the structure, the authorities in Rojava, the administration is very accepting of the Yazidi community, but we know that they've been going through a very oppressive history in the past in Iraq and also Syria. But I'm also Kurdish. Perhaps I could say a few things about religion in southern Kurdistan. My family was religious, I have to say, but I always had the freedom to practice or not to practice religion. So in the Kurdish society tends to have this freedom where everyone is free to decide if they want to. Not everyone, but generally there is the freedom to practice religion or not to practice. So I think that distinguishes the Kurdish society somehow from the other societies in the Middle East, so to speak. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to address your question as much as I can. Let me try to give a brief sort of like intro into. I agree, like you said, the situation in Rojava is promising in many ways. What do I mean by this? Unlike any of the countries, administrations in the region, in Rojava, religious groups have autonomous organizing. You know, so this logic of grassroots from the bottom to the left type of organizing that Kiki mentioned in her message in the chat box, that encompasses religious minorities and their organizing too. The biggest religious group are Sunni Muslims, and then we have the Armenians, the Assyrian Christians, you know, the Armenian Christians, and Yazidis, and some, you know, Alawi populations too, especially closer to Afrin. And all of these groups have, unlike in Turkey, unlike in other countries, all of these groups have the right to maintain their prayer services, prayer spaces, establish new prayer spaces without getting any sort of approval from the from the autonomous administration. They have the right to establish their own schools, which are, you know, which have like specific ways of education programs, you know, like Armenian Assyrian schools for Armenian Assyrian children. So I think this sort of grassroots model of mobilization in which communities, religious communities, have autonomous power and organize different aspects of their lives themselves is one of the key like elements that enable that multi-religious, like religious plural environment. And I think I agree with your observation about Kurdish society. And I think part of this has been enabled by the fact that in the region we've been an oppressed group as opposed to like a hegemonic oppressing group, but also partly because, how do I put it? Like partly because of the oppression we've had, but also partly because of the strides women have been making with their autonomous organizing and how that impacts, how that impacted the movement and sort of enabled the growth of space for minority or religious minority organizing. Thank you for your intervention again, and I think we have Sergio on stack. Oh no, sorry, my bad. Did we have someone else before Sergio? Oh yeah,
Jeffrey,
yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. So personally, I'm kind of critical of religion per se. I'm not really a big fan of it, but so I'm not gonna go into too much depth as to why religion is so great. But I did read get something from the readings, which was the adoption of religion or claiming religion was more so like a presupposed condition of these movements. Like it was out of necessity. And it was something that like that was used to further the goal for emancipation. It wasn't so much like religion is great, look at all these great things within religion that's adopted as one of our tenets, but more so like it's from the grassroots movement that religion kind of manifest into this force to emancipate, right? So that was something that I found interesting. I feel like we kind of moved away from that in the discussion. I was hoping we could talk more about like how the grassroots influences these hierarchical structures rather than the hierarchy influencing like the masses themselves. Just because when you look at liberation theology or we look at the Zapatista movement, that's pretty much all I got from it. And that it was actually the people that were influencing this this thing that has like tried so hard to enslave them and shape them into what the European idea of it is to be a human, I guess, in a sense. And I also got the same feeling from the Kurdish readings, especially how they said you can't pray in Kurdish, so people said, forget you guys, we're just gonna go outside and pray. It's once again, it's just this grassroots movement that's forcing this hierarchical structure to reshape its foundations and inherent contradictions. All right, thank you though.
If I may, I'm gonna try to quickly address. I'm like Kiki will know more about this sort of Chiapas Zapatista part of the answer to this question, but regarding Rojava and the Kurdish movement, what I can try to say is, like, first let me say this, Jeffrey. I have my as an atheist, I have my critical approach towards religion too. But regarding the point you made, I agree that the Kurdish movement is not has not seen sort of like an increase in participation in it by Muslim Kurds, and the increase in like sort of Islamic motives and arguments inside Kurdish politics did not come about because the Kurdish movement was seeing as a religion as a great source of, you know, like not to reclaim it and point it as a great source of liberation. Maybe initially it may seem like it was more as a tactical calculation to, you know, sort of compromise or do some things to like add Muslim Kurds to the base and shape them. But I would argue that that hasn't been the case much either. What I want to emphasize is it was neither like a top-down imposition or transformation, nor a top-down like reversal of policy, viewing religion as a great potentially liberatory force, as opposed to that, oh, religion is the opium of the masses. What I'm trying to argue is a third scenario where which doesn't quite fall in either of these two categories, but which falls in a category of prefiguration, I would argue. You know, with prefiguration, with the grassrootization of the movement, there was this need, obvious need, because you're a people's movement, right? You're representing millions of people are lending you support, and the society in which you're operating, it's Muslim majority, and the relationship you have built to that Muslim majority, and the relationship you have built to like Islam and religion plays an important role in the way in which the conflict with Turkey was going on. So I think what ended up coming as the third way was this awareness of, okay, you know, the state has been manipulating and using religion for all these decades, and we do need to break that, right? Like mosques disseminating Turkish propaganda decade after decade, and like the state destroying the Kurdish madrasa system, and but it was neither out of this glorification of religion with like great libertarian potential, or top-down like fake strategic top-down imposition, but more like, okay, this is something we have to do. We cannot be a people's movement without like support from all sectors of society. And why, instead of trying to shape and adopt, let's see how Muslim Kurds are approaching this. And the more and more Muslim Kurds became active in the politics, more and more concepts such as democratic Islam, the congresses, the assemblies came up. So, and I thought it was helpful, that distinction I tried to make in the case of Rojava between the religious assembly, which is the grassroots, widely like the grassroots religious mobile organizing, and the religion and beliefs office, which is more like the honest component of the organizing, if that makes sense. Yes. Was it Sergio? Oh, and the point about Yazidis, yeah, especially with what happened in Shengal since 2014, there has been like increasing awareness. Unfortunately, to be a bit self-critical, Kurdish society has been prosecuting and has participated in the prosecution of its Yazidi members over the past century at different points. But I think with what happened in Shengal and the role the Kurdish movement and the PKK played in it, it not only increased the trust between the Kurdish movement and the Yazidis in Bashur, but also raised more awareness in Rojava. I mean, some of the, like a close friend that I was staying at in Kamishlu, her brother had passed away while working in the operation to have that corridor from Shengal to Rojava, like evacuating tens of thousands of people. And there are Yazidi houses in Rojava at the moment, which still work to repatriate Yazidis, especially women and kids who were kidnapped by ISIS.
Emre, I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
I have to go off now because we have just a little bit more than 10 minutes to go, and we have Sergio, and then Kiki would like to say something, after listening to all of the contributions.
Apologies.
And anyone else who hasn't spoken yet, please, we can stay a little bit over time. We'd love to hear your comments. And sorry, I know it's, we have a lot of questions for our moderators, but yeah.
Yeah, so I want to say 2 points on some of the things that we have discussed. The first one is related with Marxism. So I think, well, Marx, he grew up like between the 1820s, 1830s in a moment that religion was part of a counter-revolution in Europe. So sometimes we forget that he experienced that kind of like a very conservative religion. And he was like, some of his ideas were developed in this kind of historical context. And in that sense, I agree with some of the aspects that Jeffrey and Linda were saying about how to conceive a grassroots religion as well, and also the cosmos, how people interpret religion through the cosmos as a way of understanding the world. In the 2 readings, 2 things caught my attention. In Emre's, the moment in which he talked about the funerary ceremonies that Kurds practice for guerrilla who were killed during the war. So I think that's very important. One important aspect of how people conceive rituals as part of also of expressing a political thought. The second one is about the reading on the Exodus in Chiapas. So in page 137, there's one line that I think is really beautiful. I'm gonna read it. So, quote, "We Indians are made by God, and therefore we are of value and have a force of growth in our hearts." End of quote. So in that sense, how through all these readings, the Exodus in Chiapas especially, there's a way of understanding God not like as a superior being, but also as somebody that is accompanying people, is with the people, and it's like promoting change in societies, promoting something that people can achieve. And in that sense, both experiences of religious from these, like, let's say, grassroots movements, they have this, the concept of human being as change, as it is possible to change. It is possible to think that people they have dignity, that people can aspire towards community, for example. Also that the importance of humility, especially in the Exodus in Chiapas, that not everything is up for the human being and his will, because it's something that is very like inside the idea of modernism, that human being is like the only person who is going to transform everything, but also an open possibility of how people might be. So in that sense, there's a concept of struggle, of human struggle within this relationship, not something like dogmatic that is reproduced, but something that has an idea of the cosmos that can be changed, and it is part of both an individual and communal movement.
Wow, what a group y'all have. I could just be here just listening to y'all for far longer than 2 hours. If it's okay, I've been listening to folks and just taking some notes, and so I'm just going to try in just a couple of minutes, because I don't think we have a lot of time left. But something that came up is this question of what are the things that are inherent to some religions, and Elptican, I think it was pointed out that there are some things inherent to Abrahamic religions, and I think patriarchy was what you mentioned, and I caught that in the Womack reading the translation. Like there was a section said that like God, you know, that we dominate the earth, and I was like, fuck, like that is a very Abrahamic kind of thing, and I think that with Zapatista practice, definitely that's not at all from what I see. I don't think that they've accepted that. And it comes from, I think, or I don't know where it comes from, but what I do know, like with the Zapatistas, they talk a lot about, like, they're very anti-doctrinal in terms of they're always changing as realities change and as context requires, and this question of necessity. So, so I think that, yeah, I was very, like I think Sergio even mentioned earlier that like, and uptick into that there's a lot of diversity in religions, that religions are always transforming, there's transformation, and we can't really talk about it as just a one kind of, in this case, Christianity. And in fact, when we look at the history of Christianity and understand like Jesus Christ as a historical figure, that was a revolutionary, like against empire. And until Constantine takes over and makes it a state, like it's so crazy how empire co-opted it, and that's all we know now. And I think that's really important for us to critique whenever we see it, and it's something that I see being critiqued by a Jewish theologian named Mark Ellis, who talks about Israel in this way. He's one of the very few people I know in the United States doing something interesting on the question of Zionism, because he talks about it at this level of theology. And I think that a lot of the Palestine Solidarity movement like will invite him to places, but don't really know what to do with what he says. And basically like what he says is with the Holocaust, there was a massive crisis in Judaism over the question of God. How could God have allowed this to happen? And so then the answer Zionism has, well, Israel will never allow this to happen. And so then Israel, the state, becomes God. That I think is really key in that can help us in asking some more different kinds of questions when it comes to Israel, Palestine, and not just there, but beyond. On the question of nationalism, there's a lot to say. EZLN, the word national liberation, national is in EZLN. But like as all of these words, I think that words have uses and not meanings. And so looking to see how the Zapatistas use that word, and even I threw up in the chat their very harsh critique of nationalism that they just presented, that they've had for a while, but in August of this past year, they had a communique that they read in Madrid with the march that they had. And it's a massive critique of nationalism. And they point to how it's a global struggle. And I think that this is a new task that our generation has now that previous generations didn't have, precisely this planetary understanding of ourselves vis-a-vis difference. And I think this is where a lot of things are, we're seeing a lot of massive conflicts. So I think a lot about the Taliban, for example, how they beat the empire, and that's fucking crazy. 20 years and they beat, and they're an indigenous group, they're from below. But it's important, I think, to make distinctions. Yes, a lot of us are oppressed, but how do we respond in terms of what proposal do we have for the world? And the proposal that groups like that have are to impose one way on everybody. So it's more like the way that I understand right and left. And I definitely take that point. We really do, I think, need to talk more about the way that we use words, but the way that I understand right is imposing one way and not respecting difference. And what I understand left as is the radical respect of difference. So the left as being a world where many worlds fit, whereas the right is the imposition of one world, which is a project of fucking the Pope, of Isabella and Ferdinand from 500 years back, that I think a lot of movements in, or a lot of peoples, a lot of indigenous peoples, when we have one world imposed on us, we can respond in many different ways. And sadly, one way that many of us are responding is through this fundamentalism, whether it's a Christian fundamentalism or Islamic, where we then want to say, like, no, we're going to impose our way. We're not going to get your way imposed. And so then there isn't like this understanding of how can we share the world together. And I think that that's really, really key for us. And I think that, at least in my project, it really entails having these conversations with people who are moving to, I think most people are more left, but the options that we get are more right wing. So I just want to make sure, like, if we're going to be in this battle, that we really do disagree on stuff. Maybe we can have these conversations at the level of what is the meaning of life? How do you see the world? Like the cosmovision, spirituality, religion, ideology, whatever it is that we call it. And so I think that that's really key in this moment right now, especially in a context of nuclear war, that this question of this war that's being fought, and our resistance, how is it that we're going to do it overall in a way that can continue life on the planet, continue each other on the planet. And I'll skip over some stuff because I'm running out of time, but very, very quickly, just one more is the question of the non-dualism that Alex brought up in the chat. This for me was like the light bulb moment. Like when I realized just how common the binary is of superior, inferior, the Manichaean good and evil of Western political thought. And it became strange to me when I started to study Mesoamerican philosophy, which understands difference, like male, female, for example, as not binary, but complementary and fluid, and differences like that. This is like the primary move, understanding humans and non-humans, not as superior, inferior, but in collaboration. And so, and these are questions that I really only see in theology and divinity schools. That's why I think that they're so important over there. And I think that if we can talk about them more in our movements, and I think that, and myself as a popular educator, it means meeting people where they're at, even if we don't already agree. And a lot of people are already at that spiritual or religious kind of mode. And I've been able to find that I can talk political philosophy because they're talking political philosophy. They're just calling it religion, and I'm calling it philosophy, you know? And yeah, and on the grassroots influence, this question of patience, I think, is really important. Understanding that we can all transform. And in the Womack reading, in the translation, we saw that, you know, like a line where it said, you know, how can I, if I do not help the Ejido commissioner with my thought, I have no right to say the commissioner is of no use. So it's like not canceling out the commissioner right away because he doesn't understand me. I'm trying to help convince and trying to get him to think of what my thought is. And so it's that patience. And I think it's back to maybe this oneness, or I don't know, you didn't say it that way. I think it's Dana, but this idea of like the golden rule, do unto others as you do unto yourselves. Like this is actually very common in many religious thoughts, and the way that I have learned from the Zapatistas in trying to understand how I want to live, I've been able to have more patience with people precisely because I've been given so much patience. I was raised in the United States, incredibly reactionary schools. I was a Zionist before I knew how Israel had been created. You know, I've undergone transformation. I wasn't always knowledgeable about things. And it's not a guarantee that education will get us all into this liberatory space. But if we don't try, then we're going to be giving up on a lot of people and we're going to be fighting people completely unnecessarily if we could have just had these kinds of discussions, debates together. Oh, and I also wanted to shout out to Ilhan. Ilhan, you're over here somewhere. Hey, there you are. Ilhan and I were, I was the quote unquote assistant teacher in one of their classes. But oh, and very quickly, just to mention that if folks want to learn more about Zapatista thought practice and like how, you know, we can be in conversation with our own geographies and calendars. I do a lot of work with some compas here, Alptic and Anya, with a network in the United States called Sexta Grietas. And I don't know if someone might, I can put it in the chat in case anyone is interested. And we have an educational team there and doing climate change stuff too. Oh, Enrique is here too. I can't see him, but hola compa. Emre, I don't know if Emre, are you the only one on the stack?
Am I on the stack?
There's a little asterisk.
Oh, I may have misused it. I should have put something. I put that to like share Arthur's description of what you just said, purify.
Oh, one other thing, sorry, really quickly, made of value because we're made by God. This was, someone just mentioned this. This is completely anti-capitalist. We can read it because with labor theory of value, what's valuable is only like this metabolization of nature by the worker, by the cap, right? And the rest of creation is completely valueless for the extraction of profit. So if we can read, there is so much spirituality just in philosophy and just everyday and everyday sayings, everyday feelings, and they seem so simple, but they're actually so profound.
So are there any other comments by anyone who hasn't spoken yet, especially?
In case people aren't following the chat, can somebody plug how people can get involved in ECR, if any of moderators would like to do that?
Why don't you do that? I'm not sure if they're as familiar, but also, Kiki, you didn't share the link. I'll share the link to the Sexta. Yeah, Arthur, do you want to do a pitch for ECR? That's our ritual for all of our meetings.
Sure. So I've dropped some information in the chat a few times. Just want to thank everybody for being here. But just to also kind of ground this discussion that, you know, while we love to have these collective discussions to kind of educate each other and learn with each other, and we see it certainly as an end in and of itself. We also really see this like educational practice as rooted in a political practice, and ultimately, you know, the Emergency Committee for Rojava, we're here to stand in solidarity with the revolution in Rojava in practice, in action as well. So we have things that we're working on right now. We have a campaign called Rojava Must Survive. You can, in the chat, you can see the link to our campaign page. We have regular organizing meetings. We would love to invite you all to join us and get involved. There's also a link to ways that you can join up. And to just kind of stay in the loop if you're not able to get more actively involved right now, but you want to know kind of what's going on with Rojava, what we're up to at ECR. You can follow us just about everywhere at Defend Rojava, whether it's social media platforms or defendrojava.org, our website. We have emails you can subscribe to. So just really want to encourage everybody to consider yourself welcome, and please jump in and help shape our collective work. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Emre and Kiki, for moderating and sharing your knowledge with all of us. Really pleasure
Yes.
and honor to have
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining in and thinking and talking with us.
And I think our next reading group will be in November, so we'll make sure that everyone will get an invitation. We'll continue with the Zapatista/Kurdish movement theme.
Yes, and the topic for the next reading session, and correct me if I'm wrong, Arthur, Anya, and Atteking, is going to be about the relationship between how the ECTLN changed through time from being this national movement with the idea of revolution taking the power of the state towards a communal revolution. So we're going to discuss this change, which is similar both in the PKK and the Zapatista. So we're going to have a moment to reflect about it. So thank you, everybody, and see you next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much, everybody.